Okay, hello everyone. My name is Yana Grinblat. I'm presenting for myself and Marcus Myerholtz, who couldn't be here today. And our ARTA project is Tel Aviv, an architecture of deviance. So our project began with a simple question: why do we look at normal architecture for answers? Why do we go to Rome immediately for our precedents? Why do we surrender to the most expected things? Isn't there something more interesting about the kind of lesser known, the taboo, the perverse, the deviant? And moreover, what does this deviance have to offer to us? So our thesis became a study of Tel Aviv. It's a city that denies its own history and its cultural context to kind of its benefit and its detriment. For a brief history of Tel Aviv, the city was born in the early 1900s when European Jews immigrated to Palestine, which was then a Muslim state, and they built the city from the sand up. So it was situated near the city of Jaffa, which has now been absorbed into the fabric of Tel Aviv itself. Tel Aviv isn't very far from the holy capital of Jerusalem, and yet it's completely disinterested in religion. It doesn't care that it's surrounded by conflict and violence. It doesn't care that it's in the middle of the Middle East, and it doesn't pretend to be any kind of pilgrimage site. Tel Aviv is famous for its cosmopolitan attitude. It's known as a gay destination. It's known for its nightlife, its beaches, its high-rises, its drug scene, its seaside hotels. It's really not difficult to find otherness in this city. And as a city, it's really young. So, and this, by the way, is Uriel on the right. He's one of Tel Aviv's most famous singers. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about under the four main categories: oddities, hard edges, the desire to be Western, and the search for negation or the search for and negation of identity. So our first hour in Tel Aviv, we experienced immediate oddness. We left the airport at 2 a.m. We got into a Mercedes taxi cab. The radio console was scrolling the name of a song in Hebrew, and yet the song playing was in French. And then I discovered that our taxi driver was Russian, so I spoke to him in Russian while Marcus sat nearby, and the whole experience was very weird for him. And we were jet-lagged and delirious the entire time, going from a highway to city, not knowing where we were. And in the morning, we would realize that we passed by strange buildings like this. And then we came to our hotel room with all the necessities: 2 beds, a toilet with a barely full-height door, and a giant bathtub in the middle of the room. So we got used to that. And then there was this restaurant next door that had this kind of sink, this very efficient barrier between the women's and men's bathrooms. It's a wall with a hole in it, and the sink is shared. So it was really apparent to us immediately that Tel Aviv is full of hard edges. These are moments of carelessly executed strangeness. And of course, the beach was one of our first destinations. So think of Miami, where the hotels kind of snatch up the beaches and make them completely inaccessible to anyone who isn't visiting those specific hotels. Tel Aviv does have expensive hotels, but they're across this very busy street. So the beach, which was really close to our cheap hotel, is really accessible to everybody. People flood the coastline. They use it all day long. There are even free Wi-Fi hotspots with landscape and furniture. And really far up the beach, we even discovered this section that was kind of orthodox, and you had to go to specifically like your gendered area. But basically this seemed like a religious afterthought, like an obligation that Tel Aviv had to meet. But most of the beach was covered with street performers, stylish joggers, and locals. And that's to say nothing of these impromptu dance parties that happened every so often. And of course, besides the beach, we went on to explore many of Tel Aviv's diverse neighborhoods. So one day, after visiting the art museum, which I'll come back to later, we got lost walking up the street. And we decided to continue around the block and just circle the whole thing until we came back to the start. But this took us a half hour, and we realized that we'd been circling this giant concrete barrier. So then we learned that this was surrounding a government building. And Tel Aviv kind of has no reserves about placing this very important building in the middle of town, but it's going to protect it because it is in the Middle East. We toured Tel Aviv University, which is a repository of architecture with buildings like in the style of Lucan and Mario Botta, but many of these weren't open to the public. except for the University Art Museum and the Architecture School, which was actually getting a new building constructed at the time we were there. And based on its interior, that was a godsend for that school. And then we discovered this interesting building at the edge of the campus. As we approached it, we were stopped by soldiers who told us that the building was private. They questioned if we took any photos of it. And then they told us that it was a kind of military-based training camp. So again, Tel Aviv took this off-limits building and placed it very sensitively among its context, blending it into the style of the architecture that was surrounding. We visited Rabin Square. This is a very public plaza in the middle of town, and it sprawls out in front of the city hall. And out in front of the plaza, there were children, families, business people, all sorts of people using the space. But the city hall itself was fenced off, really welcoming and unwelcoming at the same time. And there was a similar hard-edge situation at Dizengoff Mall. This was a massive mall building in the middle of town where the street kind of flowed into the building itself. The sidewalk was absorbed into it, and yet all visitors were screened for weapons at the door by security guards. So this was the line to get in. On another busy road, we found this synagogue that had a kind of appropriately placed entrance off to the side. So among all these storefronts, you could come in, and yet, approaching the entry, there was doors without handles. This building seemed to say welcome and stay out. And by the way, all along this street were a bunch of nightclubs, like this one with pink fur all over it, which is probably pleasant, but not, safe to touch. So speaking of seedy nightclubs, this is one of the most interesting places that we visited, and it's called Deli. So it's a little sandwich shop, really discreet. You have some tables, you can order a sandwich, you can get a coffee. There's a little black door in the back, and this is beyond the black door. Down some stairs. It's a rowdy nightclub, and you'd never know it. So once again, this was another example of these two close but contrasting worlds, and this very casual transition in between. So true to Tel Aviv's heterotopic nature, there's a presence of both Eastern and Western, ancient and modern. So we know that Tel Aviv is lacking in history, but its neighbor Jaffa is actually first mentioned in ancient Egyptian scrolls. Here we have an Egyptian gate. Legend has it that the rock to which Andromeda was chained before Perseus saved her is located here in Jaffa. We found that rock. So this, of course, is a city, little district full of history itself. So Jaffa is a really charming neighborhood. It has a kind of artist community. Its streets look like this. They're very non-direct, very tightly bound. And this is the market where you could buy hot dog statues and Turkish coffee. And so you get this Middle Eastern kind of persona, but there's a push to homogenize even Jaffa. And that results in condos like these in the middle of that entire area that I just showed you. And they seem really not genuine and kind of bland when compared to the rest of the city, right? There are even suburban villas that are trying too hard. And on the other hand, Tel Aviv really welcomes influences from the West. The clearest embodiment, I would say, is in the skyscrapers. So the steel and glass obviously contrasts with buildings like those in Jaffa, which are very traditional. These skyscrapers were really light and transparent, and yet they kind of destroyed the context of the very pedestrian-friendly feel of Tel Aviv. So this is the Ramat Gan district. It's a high-end residential cluster of towers that are kind of separate from the rest of Tel Aviv. And they created these very empty suburban spaces, which when we wandered through them, we were left feeling really lost, kind of anxious. The Azrieli Center is another great example. This one's an office building. So at its base, we have a giant mall where, again, you pass through security. You come in, and below you are 6 floors of escalator. Above you are 3 towers. So Marcus and I really were interested in this complex contrast between the old and the new that Tel Aviv was offering us, but we were worried about the prospect of skyscrapers like this that were distracting from the pedestrian spaces of all of Tel Aviv. And that leads us to our final topic, which is kind of the ambiguity of identity that's written into the history of Tel Aviv itself. So in the early history of the city, of course, as I said, Jewish immigrants came in from post-World War I Europe. They established the Bauhaus style here. So the Bauhaus style wasn't really a pastiche of the past. It was more of an eclectic architecture, and it shaped the look of the city. And this look kind of persisted into buildings like Preston Scott Cohen's addition to the brutalist Tel Aviv Museum of Art. And the interior is a very interesting space. It creates this really challenging kind of perception as it circulates around the central void, which is called the light fall. And that really distracts from the monumental shape of the museum. Obviously, that contrasts with the void. The building itself is really self-contradicting. You know, you wouldn't expect this out of a cultural institution. And despite all that, Tel Aviv desires an identity. There's a sort of cover art architecture theme in the whole city. So think of it like a song by a different musician. It's not a remix, but it's the same thing with a variation. So this is Aqua Tower by Jean Gang. This is Frank Gehry, Somewhere in Between Styles. Aldo Rossi, Cesar Pelli. And this identity crisis of a building that's not really covering anybody. But despite this deviance, this postmodernity, it's this ambiguity that we loved about Tel Aviv. After World War II and after Israel became established as a nation, all these brutalist buildings popped up in Tel Aviv. So, for example, the city hall that I mentioned earlier, many of these were government buildings, the World Zionist Organization House, or just generic office buildings. Using this very rote language of modernism, which is the kind of language of Western architecture, is a very acontextual move on Tel Aviv's behalf. It's kind of a superficial effort to apply some kind of identity. So we didn't think this was a form of deviance for its own benefit, but it was more of a homogenization of the world, and it really hurt the architecture of Tel Aviv in our eyes. So in simultaneously negating and confirming its own identity, Tel Aviv created a challenge for us. But there was this building that engaged the dialectic successfully. This is the Peace Perez House by Fuchsas, and it's in a suburb, and it's both kind of massive and light. It's part of the land and the sea. And even this entrance, which requires you to kind of circulate around the building to get to the front door, creates a duality and a tension between the landscape off to the side and the building itself. And the facade, as you see, is composed of these striations, which are almost like concrete slabs floating in the middle of the ocean or the sky. And that's most visible at the corner of the building where you could see right through it. Even this kind of like glass box above the projection offers both transparency and reflectivity. So it's really just another contradiction. And here's the landscape looking out to sea. This building really isn't unlike the identity crisis that is going on in Tel Aviv. You know, it's a conflict with its national culture and one of a larger global nature. If we've really learned anything from the deviance of Tel Aviv, it's that it should be embraced. It has something to offer us, and we should really look into its contradictions and find something interesting to learn from them. So obviously Tel Aviv is really pedestrian-oriented. There are broad avenues. They kind of string together all the cultural institutions around the city. The plazas are places for exchange, places for gathering, very social. And walking down Dizengoff Street, for example, which is the heart of Tel Aviv, that's a regular custom for people. It becomes a space for watching and being watched, and even this cafe culture has emerged among the locals. And I think that's one of the most comforting, interesting things we found about Tel Aviv. But if that's not enough for you, you can always get an Israeli salad from a waitress wearing a bunny costume. Thank you.